Hey everybody, this is Britton here. If you're new to the group, welcome. For those of you who don't know, I hope you know by now, but my name is Britton Latulip, and we're going to continue our discussion. Last week, Sharon asked a question about, well, it's kind of a national phenomenon, and we all kind of laugh about it. I'm sure you've seen the man on the street interviews where somebody goes out with a camera and they just ask basic questions, sometimes to adults, but oftentimes to college students. Or there was one video where a senior took a camera around and he interviewed all of the graduating seniors. So this is their 13th year if they went to kindergarten, 13 years of public school, public education. They spend all day there. They have tons of homework, 13 years. And then he asked them basic questions like, can you name a country? Who is the first president? In what war did we win our independence? Just basic questions like that. Every kid should have learned, should have had some sort of class on. And most of them, or many of them, could not answer those basic questions. It's pretty sad. And when you spend so much time on education and you come away learning so little, which is something that's going on nationally in public school, you think, how is that even possible? So last week we talked about layered learning. That's one reason. I'm not going to rehash that again. Sharon said, how do you implement layered learning? She wants her kid to learn in a way that they actually retain. So after they learn it, they can recall it someday if they ever need to. And we talked about layer learning, how that was really important. It's really hard to start layer learning in high school. It's really meant to be a curriculum that starts in the beginning, and we add layers, and kids continue to review, learn a little bit so they're not overwhelmed, and then add another layer, add another layer. And as they add each layer, it continues to build and overlap from the beginning to the end. Where public school, it's block learning. You take a class like chemistry, you'd never see it until, let's say, high school. Nothing, boom, huge mountain, learn so much, everything there is to know about chemistry, boom, drops off, and then you never see it again. And so you know nothing, you're overwhelmed, and then you forget it all. And like I took AP chemistry many years ago, and I don't know anything anymore. It's all gone. I did pretty well in it. It's all gone. I didn't learn it because I learned it in the block schedule fashion. So that was layers. If you want to know more about that, why you need to teach in layers and how to implement that, it's in the book. It really is hard to start in high school, and it's really hard to start if you don't have a layered curriculum, and there are no layered curriculums that I know of. I've looked for them. We originally, when we wanted to teach our kids, we looked for curriculum that was layered. I just can't find it. So we are building it, and sadly, it's going to be a while before we get to high school. But if you understand the principle, you'll know how to implement it. I'm going to continue to go with how do you teach in a way that kids retain what they're learning? I'm going to give you the second point. I talked about this last week. I alluded to it. And then the most important point, it's out of order, but the most important point we'll probably do next week. It's so missed, and it's so important. It's central. But today I want to talk about learning in levels. So we talked about learning in layers. Now we're going to talk about the what I call the learning pyramid. And you've probably, when you're studying this stuff, you probably learned about learning styles and all that stuff. I debunk a lot of that stuff. This is the learning pyramid. It's kind of like a style, but it's the same style for everybody. We all learn the same way. Mostly learning styles is a myth. I'm not going to get into that today. You probably disagree because I haven't debunked it. If you want to know more, read the book, or maybe someday I'll debunk that. But my theory is that we all learn in a similar way, and it's on a spectrum between passive and active learning. So the more passive the learning is, the less you learn and the less you retain. If it's completely passive, you might do an hour-long class and you'll come away just remembering a few things, maybe. If it's very active, it could be a 5-minute class and you'll retain it maybe for the rest of your life. So active and passive. And how that works in the learning pyramid is we start at the bottom of the pyramid, and I have the pyramid because it works so well. So I think of it this way. At the bottom, you have the most basic is listening. So listening is the most passive. It's at the very bottom of the learning pyramid. And it's so wide because it takes that much time listening to equal this much time and this much time and this much time as it goes up the pyramid. So at the top, it takes the least amount of time to learn the same material as it would take this much reading, if that makes sense. I explain it better maybe in the book. But we start off at the bottom, and that's listening. And that's a problem because listening is the most passive, but it's also what you usually do in school. You sit there and you get lectured to. And the problem with lectures is, one, if something confuses you, you have no way to interact with it or ask a question right away. You're just passively listening. The other thing is you're daydreaming. And you're not thinking or processing it at your own pace. Maybe they say something and you say, wait, I need to reread that, or I need to rethink about that, or redo that, to just take a mental note for a second. But you don't have that because the lecture is moving on. So a lot of times it's so passive and you can't keep up, and it's going into one ear and you're not having any time to process it and think about it. So it's literally going in one ear and out the other. And I took a class a while ago. I talked about this in here. I took a real estate class because we have some rentals. I was going to sell them. I thought, I'll take a real estate class. So I took a real estate class, and we had these kids, and the more they struggled, I said the note takers struggled the most. So you had these people, and they were just constantly just writing notes. Everything the teacher said, they'd scribble down and write. And they struggled proportionally to the amount of notes that they took. And it was really sad because those people were working so hard to get their notes down. But it's totally passive. They're listening. They're not even able to think about or process anything. They're just listening, and then they're just writing, regurgitating. Worst way to learn ever. And what happened is at the end of the week, we take these tests, and all the kids have their stacks notes, and they're trying to figure it out, and they're really, really confused. And then me, I just kind of sat there passively, and I shouldn't say passively. I just sat there. I didn't take any notes, and people thought maybe I wasn't taking the class seriously. And then at the end, I did really well in the test. I was one of the first ones done, if not the first one done. And I pretty much aced the test. And people were like, man, how do you do it? You must be a genius. No, I actually didn't take notes for a reason. It's not that I'm any more intelligent than the other people or can retain any faster. I wanted to retain the material, so I purposely didn't take notes. Because notes is super passive. You're not thinking, you're just copying mindlessly. And as the teacher's talking that fast, you don't have time to process anything she's saying. You're just regurgitating, writing notes, so you don't learn anything. So what I did when the teacher was talking is I actively sat back and I would listen to what she's saying and process it. That's because it's more active that way. And then what I'd really do is at the break, there's all these people who are confused and they're trying to make sense of their notes. And then I would teach them, and I'll tell you why in a second. Well, actually, I'll tell you why real quick. Teaching is the most active. If you can teach, you'll remember and you'll retain. You have to teach. It's the top of the pyramid. Teaching is key. So I knew that. So that's how I aced this class. It looked like so easy. It looked like a genius. But actually, when I was teaching them, I was learning. I was searing it into my memory so I couldn't forget. Because once you teach, it's very hard to forget. So here are the steps in the learning pyramid, from passive to active. Listening is the least active, so the most passive. Listening is the worst, and that's horrible because that's what most schools mostly do. You sit there and you listen, very passive. You can't remember it that way because your brain isn't actively engaged. You're listening. And if you stop for a second, she makes a point, in her lecture, and you stop for a second, start processing it, you'll start to remember it, but all of a sudden you forgot, you're not listening anymore, so you miss all that she's teaching. It's a very, very bad way to do it. The next is a little bit more active, and that's reading. And the reason that reading is a little bit better than listening to somebody talk is with reading, you can pause. You can put the book down. You can think about what you just read for a second. You could look up if you don't understand a word or something. Instead of shooting up your hand every time, you can look up the words. The other thing is you can get done and you can reread it without having to take notes and try to go back to it. I guess with listening, you could maybe record, and that would be a way to go back. But you can highlight when you're reading. So you say, okay, I don't need to know everything. I'm not going to memorize this entire chapter. What are the key points? So reading is a little bit more active. It allows you to have a little bit more freedom in thought, and you can interact with it. The problem is it's still somebody else's thought. Like they did all the thinking, and you're just passively analyzing and kind of regurgitating what they thought about it. So it's not as active. It won't stick with you as much. You'll read this book. I tell people you should never read a book once. If you read a good book, you should read it many times. You don't always move on to a new book. If a book is worth reading, it's worth reading 3 or 4 or 5 times. Because again, reading is a little bit more passive. And so you'll have to really get it, to really sink it into your memory, you're going to have to read it many times and process it. So you have to rethink it, process it many times. So reading is the second most passive. The reason reading was so important back in the day is you maybe didn't have access to these teachers like Plato, okay? You're never going to meet Plato, but you can actually read his stuff after he's dead. So it's really important that they were able to pass on wisdom through reading. So reading is really important. That's why it was so central to education, is you'd be able to tap back into the masters like Julius Caesar, one of the great, rulers of Rome. And he talks about military, and he actually writes in his own words this memoir on his wars. That's so awesome that you can tap into his mind, his mindset, and see what he wrote. And you wouldn't have had that because they didn't have a way to record audio back then. So reading is a little bit more passive. It's the next step up. I'm not saying reading is bad. It's the second lowest form. We have 6 in this pyramid, and it's the second most passive. Listening is the worst. Reading is the next. The third best is observing. So it'd be so cool if, Julius Caesar. Imagine if, okay, you read his book, cool. You get some stuff out of his book. He can only write so much. There's so much nuance to his leadership and stuff. You can only get so much, from his book, and it's his own kind of perspective, what he wants you to think about him. But imagine if you could rewind, go back in history and actually observe Julius Caesar. You can actually see him in action, his leadership, watch his battles and stuff. That's observing. That's a little bit better, okay? Same thing. Imagine if you're learning art. You want to become a painter, and you don't have access to a master or something like that for personal training. So that you could listen to a lecture on art. That's gonna be tough. You could read about art. That's a little better. But then imagine if you could observe. You could just watch an artist painting. You'd learn so much from that, watching the process. So many times you take the tips, and it's great, but it's so much better to actually you go on YouTube. It's painful because some of these artists, they take maybe 6, 7, 8 hours to do their artwork. But instead of just watching the finished product or getting some tips, watch them from start to finish. Put that thing together. You will learn so much more from observation. Or if you want to ride horses, how much can you learn about riding horses from listening? A little bit. Reading a little bit more because you can process it better. But then you observe somebody. You get a much better concept of riding a horse, what it takes, how it works through observation. So observation is good. But observation is still a passive form. So those are the 3 bottom of the pyramid, passive. Because when you're observing somebody doing something, you're not participating in it. You're not actually handing them material. You're just passively observing what they're doing. But they're processing, they're thinking. That's active. You're passive. So bottom 3 of the pyramid is listen, read, and observe. Bottom 3 of the pyramid. If you do those things, you're the least likely to retain the information that you're learning. Sometimes because we don't have a better way, we have to do those 3. But if you wonder why kids in school learn so little, one is layers. I'm not going to explain that again. We did it last week. Look it up or read the book. The book's great. I lay it out better in the book. These extemporaneous talks, I can only do so much. But so we talked about layers, but the next one will be passive and active. So those are the bottom 3. Those are passive. And the reason the school kids learn so little is because it's all passive. Most of them only get up to observation, and most of them don't get observation. They listen and they read. They listen to lectures from their teacher, and they can't help it. They daydream. It gets so boring. Your mind wanders. You can't process it that fast. Then they go home, and that's when I would learn. I would read from the book, and you learn a little bit more. You can reread it. You can try to memorize it. You can wrestle with it a little better. You can pause, so reading's a little bit better. And then sometimes you get to observe things in school. Not very often. Usually it's only classroom. You don't actually observe a master of the trade in action. So even observing you don't get a lot of times in public school. So you're just in the bottom 2 rungs. Okay, now we go up the pyramid to the top, and we got the top 3 rungs, and these are all active, but we're going to go from less active to more active. But I would say these are all in the active category. These are all good. So after observe, the 4th one up the pyramid, which is good, is practice. Okay, practice is great because you're actually doing it. You're not just observing a painter now. You are actually painting. You're getting out the paints. You're putting it on the canvas. You're seeing how it doesn't stick or how you didn't mix colors. Your brain is interacting with what's going on now. And you say, man, oh, that didn't work or this did work. You can do trial and error, but you're retaining it. You're learning it. You're going through the process. You're actively engaged in the process. So practice is better. Practice is not the best, but practice is better. And usually you have some sort of curriculum, some sort of like skills or something that you're practicing up to. That's really good. And practice is very similar to the next step. The next step up is do. Okay, the difference between practicing and doing. Okay, I go to jiu-jitsu. Jiu-jitsu is a martial art. It's basically submission wrestling. You choke people out. You do arm bars, stuff like that. If you watch the UFC, it's what they do for the most part. It's a mixed martial art. It's not as much striking. It should be. It is. And it doesn't matter. It's jiu-jitsu, but that's what jiu-jitsu is. And when you go to practice, it's a different mentality. Hey, how are you, Sharon? So we are talking about levels right now. You can rewatch some of the video. It's definitely in the book. But this is how to retain what you're learning. So we're talking about passive and active and the different levels, or the learning pyramid, as I call it. So in jiu-jitsu, when I go to practice, it's very different than doing jiu-jitsu. You think you're doing, but actually we're working some techniques. It's a very relaxed atmosphere. We're enjoying ourselves. The enemy isn't trying to kill me. Remember, jiu-jitsu is a combat sport. So this is not combat in practice. We're enjoying ourselves. I'm not trying to kill the other guy. He's not trying to kill me. But we're actively engaged. I'm taking what I know and I'm applying it so it's active. Okay, that's practice. Doing is this next step. Doing is when I go compete. I go compete, and now that guy is trying to kill me. At least he's trying to defeat me. He's trying to tap me out, and we're going hard, and he's not going to take it easy on me because he's my friend. He's not going to worry about hurting me. He's going to try to finish me. It's a combat sport. Now we're doing. With horse riding, it's very different to get on a horse with the instructor, and she's leading it, and you're going in a circle practicing. Then you take that horse out on your own. You go up into the mountains, and you start to actually do horse riding, what it's intended to do. A lot of people get this confused in school. They think that, oh, my kid is... he's doing math. No, he's not doing math. He's practicing. If you're doing worksheets, that's not what math is for. When you get into the adult world, you don't get worksheets. So that's all practice. You're practicing the principles. It's not doing. Doing is when you take those principles and you do something with it. I build a house, and now I'm using the geometry that I learned to lay out and design this house and put together the different angles and stuff. That is doing. So see the difference? The textbook is not the same thing. It's pretty funny because I was like a math whiz, kind of. I mean, I was gifted in math, is what the school said. I talk about that. It's just a label. But I was gifted in math. And real whiz, I took all the calculus and stuff like that. And everybody thought I was this math whiz. But I go to my grandpa's farm, help him in the summer, and he's building something. And I still don't fully understand what it was, but he asked me this mathematical question, and I didn't understand it. I couldn't process it because I didn't have the equation in front of me. So I'd practiced, but I couldn't apply it to doing in the real world. So if you want to remember what you're doing, you got to remember what you're learning. You have to get kids doing it, really doing it, applying it. It can't just be math in a textbook. That's just practice. You have to do real math. Okay. So doing is so important. And I'm going to get to the tricky ones, like how do you do history? Well, you don't. You can't. You can't. Unless, I guess, history repeats itself metaphorically. But really, you can't do history. So up to there, you have to pretty much read, you listen. That's pretty much all you can do for history. But we'll get to the next one in a minute. So that's doing, okay? The final step up, the highest rung you can get. This is when you become a master. This is how you retain and never forget. The last step, it's better than doing. It's teaching. Teaching is so important. I've been doing jiu-jitsu for a long time. There's so many things I just do on instinct, naturally. I've done it for so long. Maybe I've just developed things. I know that, oh, this choke doesn't work unless you do this or you set it up this way. The beginner doesn't know that. Maybe I don't even know that. I do it subconsciously because I've done it so much doing. But now you have to teach. You have to sit down. You have to break it down and say, okay, why does it work when I do it this way? How does it work? And you're teaching somebody else. You can never forget it after you teach it, okay? I mean, usually. Sometimes you can, okay? But in principle, it's the highest form of learning. You have to teach, okay? Teaching is when you remember. It's how you master. And so that's what I was doing in the real estate class where I appeared like this whiz. It's because I taught everybody. I'd go out of my way and they'd be like, oh, thank you so much for helping me. Like, I don't understand why you get this. And they don't realize that I'm actually helping myself. I am helping myself remember it. I'm not going to go home and study it all night. I'm not going to sit there and take all those notes because I know that that's very passive learning. It's a waste of my time. But please let me teach you. Please let me teach you. My wife, she gets so annoyed. People say, how can you recall so many facts just off the top of your head when you read stuff? How do you retain it so much? I know that reading is really passive. So when I read something and I'm like, wow, that was great. I want to remember that. I leave my office. I run in the house. And my poor wife, I'm like, hey, guess what? And I just spill it all to her. And interrupt her day. And I literally do this all the time to her. You can ask her. I regurgitate everything that I've taught. And once I've said it to her, I've taught it to her. I explained it to her and she'll have questions or she doesn't understand it. And I explain, I talk her through it. Now I've learned it. It's sunk into my brain. I'm retaining it now. And then if you know me, if you're my friend, I usually tell you. Oh, and I always tell you about the history I'm learning. I'm studying and stuff. I'm not just teaching you. I'm actually going through the process of learning it myself. I'll get your objections and then I'll have to wrestle with those. You'll give me a different perspective. I'll be able to understand it, but mostly I'll be able to retain it. I won't forget it after I teach it a few times. Teaching is so important. Now, the cool thing about this learning pyramid, and people got it wrong. I didn't say it right before, okay? People thought it was steps. Like, oh, okay, well, that means you have to listen, you have to read, you have to practice, you have to do, you have to teach. Did I miss one? I said listen, read, practice, observe, practice, do, teach. And they thought you had to go through the process, and it confused people. So they say, well, I got this, or how do you observe history? Do you watch like TV shows? No, that's not even history. Those are lies, propaganda mostly, false history. But the point is you don't have to go through all of those levels. In fact, you should skip them if you can. So I would much rather observe Julius Caesar in combat. I'd much rather observe Julius Caesar in combat, observe. I'd much rather work with him, practice with him. I would much rather, well, I don't know if I'd rather do combat with him or like in battle. You get what I'm saying? I would learn more about war if I had actually gone to war with Julius Caesar. And then imagine if he made me a general and I got to teach his methods to other people. Okay, so that's teach, do. I would skip all the reading stuff. But because I don't have access to Julius Caesar anymore, he's dead, I have to do the next best thing. I have to read. I could listen to lectures on him, but I prefer to read because a little higher up. That's as high up as up the rung I could go. I could maybe practice. I could take what I've read and I could maybe practice it, like principles of it. Sure, so you could practice. You could do the principles once you've read them. Okay, but I have to go start with reading. But I won't listen. I don't have to start with listening. I start with the highest rung up. Okay, let's see. Okay, practicing. I want to learn how to build something. I don't have to read about it. I don't have to listen about it. I could jump right into practicing. I could join somebody and observe them and practice. So maybe I say, hey, I'll just work for free. Can I help you build your house? I just want to learn about it. And they're like, cool. Well, they know how to do it. So I'm observing them and I'm practicing and I'm building. I'm actually doing, I guess, in a sense too. I can just jump right into that top rung of active. Ideally, I jump into practice, do, teach. Ideally, I could skip all that bottom stuff if it's possible and just jump into the higher rungs. If you could just jump into teach, it's pretty hard to do because you have to know it first, right? But even if you don't know a whole lot and you just jump into the teaching role, you'll learn as you go. It means you'll have to go back, learn it yourself, and then teach it. So teaching is always the highest rung. That's what my kids know so much. I think that they retain so much is that they all are teachers in our home. So we have, I explain this either in this book or maybe the next book, I can't remember. But we have our kids take on leadership roles. And part of what they do is they teach the younger kids. So they learn the history. They're going to forget it in a day. But they learn the history. They would have forgotten it in a day, but now they have to teach their sibling. And they'll teach their sibling. And then the next sibling comes along, they teach it again. Well, yeah, they're teaching the sibling, and it's great for the sibling, but it's great for them because by teaching, they retain the history. By explaining it in their own words. It's the difference between listening to a sermon in church and preparing a sermon. Okay, that's the difference between doing or teaching and observing, listening, okay? Huge difference. Can you imagine how much more you learn if you prepared a sermon versus just listening to a sermon? Totally different. And how much you retain. Okay, so that's it. So basically, in a summary, there are 6 learning style or pyramid, 6 rungs on the steps of the pyramid. It's going to be listen, worst form, read, a little bit more active, observe, a little bit better. Then practice is better. We're into active now. Do, teach. That's the learning pyramid. Jump to the highest rung that makes sense. If you can just jump right into doing or practicing, that's way better than starting at the bottom, listening. You don't have to go through all of them. And your kids will retain more. So that's your next tip. There are other tips. Next week I'm going to go over another one. This is probably the crux of Blue Manor Academy. This is what really separates us. This is one of our principles, our founding principles. And I'll teach you that next week. And that's why kids learn. It's the secret to why kids learn so much more going through the Blue Manor method and curriculum than everybody else is. I'm not even going to hint at it. You just come back next week and I'll teach you the secret to learning more faster. It's not something that you've probably heard before. I almost guarantee it. It's very counterintuitive, but it works. It works wonders. So anyway, Sharon, I hope that answers you. You can watch the rest of the video. I think I did a better job at the beginning instead of just summarizing it for you, but you go back to the beginning, learn about the learning pyramid. That's really going to help your daughter retain it. So if she's really interested in art, instead of just listening to the videos and practicing it, it would be so cool if you could sit down with her and she could teach you what she's learned. That's a great way to do it. She says, oh, I learned this thing on eyes. Okay, she just learned it. She's going to forget it because she's only listened to it, observed it. She's going to forget it in an afternoon. But if you sit down with her and she teaches you, okay, oh, this is what he said and he does this, and she's doing it and teaching you, she will remember it. You won't because you're just observing, but she will remember it because she taught you. So there you go. I won't ramble anymore. If you want to know more, you can read Education. The next book is coming out soon, Character. It's more essential. These are all how we raise children for greatness. I've defined what that is before. Maybe I'll do that again for new readers someday. But it's an education style that's very different than everybody else's. That's not just some cliche when I talk about the art of raising children for greatness. That's not just some slogan that we coined together. Like, it refers to a specific learning style. These are the methods to raise children for greatness. So Anyway, we will, if you have any questions, leave them below. We've been talking about this because Sharon asked the question. Your questions are always the most important. This group is for you. So if you have questions, list them below, and that's what I'll cover. So thank you guys so much. If you have any more questions, list them below. Goodbye. See you next week.